Good morning, children. Welcome to the English session. Today, we shall discuss the poem The Legend of Northland by Phoebe Cary. Before we start the session, let me ask, are you helpful by nature? How many times have you gone out of your way to help someone in need? Well, the poem that I'm about to tell you is centered on a legend that is only about helping those in need, and if you don't, you might end up facing severe consequences. Now, without any further ado, let me tell you about the poem, The Legend of Northland, which is in the form of a ballad. Now, a ballad is typically a poem that narrates a story. The Legend of the Northland is a ballad that tells us the story of a priest asking a woman for some food, but since she was greedy and selfish, she couldn't part with any of her food. Now let's see how the events unfold. Away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few, and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through, where they harness the swift reindeer to the sledges when it snows, and the children look like bears' cubs in their funny furry clothes. They tell them a curious story. I don't believe it is true, and yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. The poet begins by introducing the place from where the legend is derived. It's in a place called the Northland, and the poet says that here in Northland the days are short and the nights are long. So that is how we know that the Northland is somewhere near the poles, where it is very cold, assuming the North Pole. So it's very cold that people cannot sleep comfortably throughout the nights, and often they wake up unable to bear the freezing temperature. Then the poet gives us a description of the people of the Northland. She says that when the snow falls, the people here like to go for sledging. For that, they tie their reindeers to their sledges. Because of the cold, the children have to wear heavy woolen clothes that cover them up fully. This makes them look like bears' cubs. In addition, the elders tell a strange and interesting story to the young ones. However, the poet does not believe that the story is true. Still, it gives an important message. Once, when the good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching, just as he did, he came to the door of a cottage in traveling round the earth, where a little woman was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. And being faint with fasting, for the day was almost done, he asked her for her store of cakes to give him a single one. So she made a very little cake, but as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give away. So the poem is about an old woman who had angered Saint Peter with her selfish act. One day, Saint Peter reached the door of a cottage where a woman was making cakes and baking them on a hearth. Now, Saint Peter was extremely tired and hungry, so he requested the woman to give him a piece of cake. She went on to bake two cakes, but each of them she was unable to part with, and it just appeared too big to her to be given away. Therefore, she needed another and still a smaller one, but it looked, when she turned it over, as large as the first one had done. Then she took a tiny scrape of dough and rolled it flat and baked it thin as a wafer, but she couldn't part with that. For she said, "My cakes that seem too small when I eat of them myself are yet too large to give away." So she put them on the shelf. In its place, she made a very small cake for Saint Peter. She did not want to share her things. However, when she placed the cake for baking, she thought that it's too big to give away. So she started making another smaller cake. When she looked at that cake, she again felt that it was as big as the previous one. Again, she was not ready to give the smaller cake to Saint Peter. The third time, she took a very small amount of dough and rolled it. She rolled the dough and made it very thin like a wafer and baked it. But she was so greedy that she couldn't give that thin piece of bread to the saint. She reasons that when she ate them, she felt them small, but when she had to give them, she felt them too big to give it to someone. And finally, she put all the cakes on her kitchen shelf and didn't give any cake to the saint. Then good Saint Peter grew angry, for he was hungry and faint, and surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. And he said, "You are far too selfish to dwell in a human form, to take both food and shelter and fire to keep you warm. Now you shall build as the birds do, and shall get your scanty food by boring and boring and boring all day in the hard dry wood." Saint Peter got angry and cursed her because he was very hungry and felt very weak. This behavior of the greedy woman angered the saint. Saint Peter cursed the woman and said that she was very selfish. She did not deserve to live like a human being. He added that God had given her food, shelter, fire to keep warm, but she had become selfish for all the resources she had. She didn't want to share them with anybody. So he cursed her and made her a bird who had to build houses by boring into the wood and collect very little food by working the entire day. Then up she went through the chimney, never speaking a word, and out of the top flew a woodpecker, for she was changed to a bird. She had a scarlet cap on her head, and that was left the same, but all the rest of her clothes were burned, black as coal in the flames. And every country schoolboy has seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. As soon as Saint Peter cursed the woman, she did not get a chance to speak for herself, because that very moment she flew up to the roof through the chimney and flew out in the form of a bird. Saint Peter's curse had converted the woman into a bird. When the woman turned into a bird, at that time she was wearing a red colored cap on her head. This cap was there on the bird's head also, but the woman's remaining clothes had burned and turned black in color just like coal. People who live in the countryside and children often see this kind of bird in the woods. The elders tell them that the bird used to be a woman earlier. She was very greedy, and so she was cursed by Saint Peter and turned into a bird. The summary of the poem. The poem is a legend about an old lady who angered Saint Peter because of her greed. The story goes on like this. One day, Saint Peter was preaching around the world and reached the door of a cottage where this woman lived. She was making cakes and baking them on a hearth. Saint Peter was fainting with hunger. She asked the lady to give him a piece of cake. The cake that she was baking then appeared to be too big, so she did not give him that, and instead she baked another smaller one. That also appeared to be big, so she did not give him that also. The second time she baked yet another smaller cake, but found it too big to give away. In the third attempt, she took an extremely little scrape of dough and rolled it flat. She had it as thin as a wafer, but was unable to part with that also. This angered Saint Peter a lot. He said that she was not fit to live in human form and enjoy food and warmth. He cursed her and transformed her into a woodpecker bird who had to bore in hard, dry wood to get its scanty food. She can be seen in the trees all day, boring and boring for food. The literary devices used in the poem. The rhyme scheme goes as A B C B. Next is the alliteration. It is the repetition of a consonant sound in two or more close words. Stanza 1, you'll find the words that, they, them, true. The sound is repeating. In stanza 2, they, the sound is repeating. Look like, the sound is repeating. Funny, furry, first sound is repeating. In stanza 3, again, they, them, the sound is repeating. Yet, you, your sound is repeating. Learn, lesson, le sound is repeating. Tell, tale, to, t sound is repeating. In stanza 5, woman was, W sound is repeating. Them, the sound is repeating. In stanza 6, faint, fasting, first sound is repeating. In stanza 8, still smaller, sound is repeating. Stanza 9, took, tiny, sound is repeating. Stanza 10, seem, small, sound is repeating. In stanza 13, build, birds, sound is repeating, and by boring, sound is repeating. Another figure of speech used in the poem is repetition. Repetition is any word or sentence is repeated to lay emphasis on it. Here in stanza 1, you'll find the word away is being repeated. Stanza 9, rolled is repeated. And in stanza 13 and 16, boring is repeated. The last one is simile. Simile is a comparison between two different objects or things using the words like or as. In stanza 2, the children look like bears' cubs. The children is being compared to bears' cubs. In stanza 9, baked it thin as a wafer. The cake is being compared to a wafer. Stanza 15, clothes were burned black as a coal. The color of the burned clothes is compared to that of a coal. Thus, we have come to the end of the session. Thank you and have a nice day.